Thank you, Mr. Director. I want to pick up where Mr. Buck began as well by thanking you for your service, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity for one Democrat, one Republican in close succession to thank you for your service to the country. You are being attacked and vilified by some of the members of this committee and others outside this committee because the Justice Department and the FBI has had the audacity to investigate serious allegations of criminal conduct by a former president. And I just want a chance to recap how we got to where we are. During the last administration, and for 4 years, the Justice Department took the position, not unprecedented for the department, that a former president could not be, a current president could not be indicted. Now, I think that's a flawed matter as a constitutional principle, but nonetheless, that was the view of the Office of Legal Counsel and the Justice Department during the Trump years, that the President of the United States could not be indicted. My Republican colleagues seem to believe that a former president similarly cannot be indicted. That would effectively make a president above the law, beyond the reach of the law. And in my view, there would probably only one thing the founders would find more politically precarious and dangerous to our Constitution than the indictment of a president or former president, and that is the failure to indict a president or former president when they have engaged in criminal conduct. The Justice Department, I believe, as Representative Lofgren, my fellow member of the January 6th committee, asserted, took a very long time to begin the investigation of Donald Trump and his involvement in January 6th. I believe it began with urgency when it came to the foot soldiers who broke into the Capitol and assaulted police officers that day. But at least what I can tell from the public record, the activities of the president himself, some of which were a matter of very much a public record, such as his tape-recorded conversation with the Secretary of State in Georgia, in which he badgered the Secretary to, quote, find 11,780 votes that don't exist. While that was the subject of investigation by the local district attorney in Fulton County, did not appear to be the subject of investigation for more than a year by the Justice Department. To me, that is inexplicable. This was never the kind of case in which you could roll up the foot soldiers on the higher-ups because there were multiple lines of effort in this plot to overturn the election. I do think that the appointment of the special counsel has accelerated the investigation of the former president's misconduct, and I think that is a positive step for the department and for the country so we can get resolution to this. But likewise, with Mar-a-Lago, notwithstanding the protests of my colleagues, there were repeated requests by the archives to get those documents back from the former president. And then when those were unsuccessful, there was a grand jury subpoena that was administered. And when that was unsuccessful, and only when that was unsuccessful, and there was evidence that the former president was still withholding highly classified materials, did the FBI go to the step of a search warrant. That was more than a year and a half after those initial requests. This was anything but a rush to judgment in the Mar-a-Lago case. So I believe the department, if anything, has exercised enormous caution, I would say too much caution, in the January 6th committee's work and oversight to proceed against a former president when there are serious and credible allegations of criminal conduct. But I want to thank you for your stewardship during this incredibly difficult time. I don't think there's been a more difficult time for an FBI director. And notwithstanding concerns I have expressed, none of them go to your integrity or your commitment to the country, and I want to thank you for that. Let me ask you about a different topic, although related to January 6th as well. But let me ask you broadly about domestic violent extremism. I offered an amendment in this committee voted down by the Republicans that we should oversee the increasingly dire threat of domestic violent extremism. One of your recent reports underscored the rise of this prevalent threat, and I'd ask you if you would address it today.
So the rise of domestic violent extremism is something that I and we have been identifying for quite some time. It goes back well before January 6th. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but the Joint Terrorism Task Forces that we hear about so often at the FBI were largely created in response to domestic terrorism, not foreign terrorism. But in my first few years as director, we were identifying this issue more and more, and that's why we elevated in the summer of 2019 racially motivated violent extremism to a national threat priority level. And we saw, I think, about a 40% increase in the number of domestic violent extremism investigations, all before anything to do with January 6th. Obviously, since then, it has continued. But domestic violent extremism cuts across the spectrum from the racially motivated violent extremism, militia violent extremism, anarchist violent extremism, environmental violent extremism, and of course, recently, we've had a lot of violent extremism attacks against pro-life facilities, and we're investigating those. So it really covers a wide spectrum, and what they all have in common is three things: violence or threats of violence, motivated by some ideology, and it varies, in violation of federal criminal law. And that's the domestic violent extremism that I'm talking about when I've identified this phenomenon.
Mr. Chairman, could I request unanimous consent to enter into the record two letters, both from David Weiss, the Trump-appointed U.S. Attorney in Delaware, rebutting allegations concerning partiality in the investigation of the Hunter Biden case?
No objection.
Thank you, Director.